June 4, 1944. The air above the English Channel was a canvas of low, churning clouds, pregnant with the promise of a storm that felt less meteorological and more existential. Below, a tempest of another kind was brewing, poised to erupt across the Normandy beaches. Allied High Command, nestled in subterranean bunkers, grappled with the monumental task of orchestrating the largest amphibious invasion in history. Every minute counted, every communication had to be crystal clear, immediate, and, above all, secure. Yet the radio waves were a chaotic battlefield, thick with enemy intercepts and static, making reliable, high-volume, secure communication an almost insurmountable challenge for frontline units. Messages were often delayed, garbled, or worse, compromised. The desperate need for a new, unbreakable, and rapid system of covert communication was palpable, a silent scream echoing through the war rooms. It was a problem that conventional military minds had wrestled with for months, finding only incremental improvements to a fundamentally flawed system. Who would have thought that the solution, the very key to unlocking the lines of command, would come from a place least expected, the seemingly frivolous world of musical rhythm? Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the tale of how the unorthodox brilliance of a young musician, dismissed by many as eccentric, fundamentally altered the course of vital operations, proving that the most profound innovations often emerge from the most unlikely corners, especially when the stakes are literally life and death. Sergeant Alistair Finch, Royal Corps of Signals, wasn't your typical wartime signals specialist. Before the conflict, his world revolved around the intricate tapestries of jazz compositions, the subtle nuances of syncopation, and the emotional resonance of a perfectly timed crescendo. Now, in early 1944, his days were filled with the monotonous clicks and static of Morse code and the grinding frustration of unreliable radio transmissions. He was stationed at a forward signals post near Dover, a cog in the vast rumbling machine preparing for D-Day. Alistair watched as urgent messages were routinely delayed, their urgency diluted by the time they reached their intended recipients. He observed the deep lines of worry etched on the faces of commanding officers, Major Evelyn Reed among them, an MI6 liaison officer with a formidable reputation for problem-solving. Reed was tasked specifically with improving clandestine communication channels. She'd tried everything from new cipher wheels to exotic forms of carrier pigeon deployment, but nothing offered the speed and security required for the impending invasion. The existing Morse code protocols, while foundational, were too slow for complex directives and too susceptible to sophisticated German intercepts, which had grown alarmingly effective. Even the most intricate ciphers, once broken, revealed the underlying Morse patterns, making them vulnerable. Alistair, nursing a lukewarm tea and listening to the familiar, frustrating rhythm of static and strained voices over the wireless, had an idea, an almost absurd whisper in the back of his musician's mind. He began tapping a complex, irregular rhythm on the metal casing of his radio set, a pattern he knew instinctively was unique. The rapid, syncopated beats were far from the conventional dot-dash of Morse. It was a rhythm, he realized, that could be interpreted as something else entirely. He began to hum, then to beat out on the table, sequences of varying length and intensity, mimicking the intricate improvisations of a jazz drummer. This wasn't just noise, it was structured sound, a language of its own. One blustery afternoon, Major Reed was conducting a routine inspection, her sharp eyes scanning the signal charts, her ear picking up the cadence of the Morse transmissions. She paused near Alistair's station, noticing his rhythmic tapping, distinct from the staccato urgency of the other operators. She watched him for a moment, intrigued by the apparent distraction. "Sergeant Finch," she stated, her voice crisp, "are you perhaps entertaining yourself, or is that a new method of communication I'm unfamiliar with?" Alistair, startled, immediately stopped. "Apologies, Major. Just thinking aloud, ma'am." "About patterns." Reed raised an eyebrow, a hint of curiosity replacing her usual professional reserve. "Patterns? Do elaborate, Sergeant." Taking a deep breath, Alistair explained his nascent idea. his words tumbling out with a mixture of nervousness and conviction. He described how musical rhythms, with their infinite variations in tempo, duration, and accent, could be far more complex and therefore more secure than the rigid structure of Morse. He argued that a message could be conveyed not by discrete symbols, but by the overall feel of a rhythmic sequence, its emotional contour, its syncopation. He demonstrated tapping a short, irregular sequence, then explaining how it could represent a specific phrase like "enemy contact imminent." Reed listened patiently, her expression unreadable. Other officers nearby, catching snippets of the conversation, exchanged glances, some smirking. A rhythm code. It sounded utterly ridiculous, more akin to a bohemian art project than a serious military communication system on the eve of the biggest invasion in history. It was pure madness. Alistair could feel the skepticism radiating from them, the silent judgment of a world that valued order and convention over spontaneous creativity. Yet Major Reed, known for her unconventional streak and desperation for a solution, saw a flicker of something different. She saw potential where others saw only eccentricity. The concept was so far outside the box, so utterly alien to traditional military thought, that it just might work precisely because of its perceived absurdity. Its very ridiculousness might be its strength, rendering it invisible to enemy codebreakers who would be searching for logical, mathematical patterns, not musical ones. She ordered Alistair to develop a small proof of concept, giving him a mere 2 weeks. "Sergeant," she concluded, her eyes fixed on his, "failure is not an option, but neither is ignoring a possibility, however remote." Alistair threw himself into the task with the intensity of a composer on the verge of a breakthrough. He knew he had to translate the abstract concept of rhythmic language into a practical, militarized system. His first challenge was standardization. Rhythm by its nature was fluid and subjective. He needed a framework. He devised a system based on established musical notation, but simplified. Each message component, a word, a phrase, a strategic command, would be assigned a unique rhythmic signature. These signatures would consist of sequences of short and long taps, pauses, and variations in speed, forming a distinct melodic rhythmic phrase. For instance, advance might be a quick triplet followed by a long beat, while retreat could be a slow, dragging 4-beat pattern. He spent sleepless nights at a small makeshift studio, tapping out countless combinations, meticulously logging them into a ledger. The codebook, a surprisingly slim volume for the complexity it contained, became his Bible. It listed hundreds of these rhythmic patterns, each corresponding to a specific military command, location, unit, or tactical instruction. He ensured that critical, frequently used commands had distinct, easily recognizable patterns, while less common but vital information could be encoded with more elaborate, nuanced rhythms. The beauty of it, he realized, was that while the individual taps might resemble Morse, their combination and timing were entirely different. A German interceptor listening for ... would only hear a seemingly random series of taps, a jumble of sound without traditional meaning. He recruited a small team of signalmen, all with some musical background, to test the system. The initial attempts were fraught with errors. Their ingrained Morse habits proved difficult to unlearn. "It's like trying to speak French with a German accent, sir," one complained, struggling to replicate a subtle syncopation. Alistair, patient yet firm, drilled them relentlessly, teaching them to feel the rhythm, not just count taps. He used a metronome initially, then phased it out, emphasizing the internal human timing crucial for authenticity. He coached them on maintaining a consistent swing, even under pressure, a characteristic that would distinguish their transmissions from any enemy attempts to mimic the code. He stressed that any deviation, any awkwardness in the rhythm, could compromise the message. It had to sound natural, like a musician performing. Major Reed returned 2 weeks later, skeptical but hopeful. Alistair demonstrated the system. He sent a complex multi-part command via rhythm, and one of his trainees, blindfolded and with his back to Alistair, transcribed it with remarkable accuracy. Reed then had her own signals experts, veterans of cryptographic warfare, listen to the transmissions, deliberately withholding the key. They listened, perplexed. hearing only what sounded like a series of irregular, almost haphazard taps. They couldn't discern any pattern recognizable to their conventional training. "It's just noise, Major," one reported, frustrated. "No discernible structure. It could be static or a clumsy operator." This was precisely what Alistair had hoped for. The ridiculous nature of the code was its greatest asset. Reed was impressed, profoundly so. The sheer unconventionality made it nearly uncrackable by conventional means. She saw the potential for a quantum leap in secure, rapid frontline communications. Within weeks, a specialized unit was formed, comprised entirely of musicians and those with an innate sense of rhythm, selected from various units across the British Army. They underwent intensive training, learning Alistair's rhythmic language, practicing under simulated combat conditions where noise and stress tried to break their concentration. They were taught to transmit and receive not just individual commands, but entire tactical overlays, geographical coordinates and troop movements, all through the complex interplay of taps, pauses, and cadences. One of the first field trials was during a clandestine reconnaissance mission in occupied France in late May. A small commando team deep behind enemy lines needed to relay critical intelligence about German fortifications. Their standard radio failed, but one of the team members, a corporal who had been a jazz drummer before the war and part of Alistair's initial recruits, managed to send a series of rhythmic pulses on a backup, low-power transmitter. Back at headquarters, a trained rhythm operator picked up the faint, almost melodic sequence. "It's them," she whispered, her fingers flying over a transcription pad, translating the syncopated message. "Target identified, heavy artillery, coordinates confirmed." The information, delivered securely and rapidly, through what seemed to enemy ears as mere atmospheric interference, allowed Allied bombers to strike a crucial target just hours before D-Day, significantly weakening German defenses. The ridiculous rhythm was proving itself invaluable. As D-Day approached, the demand for Alistair's system intensified. His Rhythm Corps, as they unofficially became known, was expanded, their training accelerated. Their skills were now considered absolutely vital for the success of Operation Overlord. Captain Rhys Jenkins, a hardened paratrooper from the 3rd Parachute Battalion, was among the officers who initially viewed the rhythmic code with deep skepticism. His unit was slated for a perilous drop behind enemy lines, tasked with securing strategic bridges. Jenkins had always relied on the tried and true on direct, unambiguous communication. The idea of entrusting his men's lives to some abstract musical tapping seemed preposterous, an indulgence almost. He'd sat through a briefing, watching a young private demonstrate the system, tapping out complex messages on a small handheld device. "So, you're telling me," Jenkins had said, his voice laced with incredulity, "that when my men are under fire needing immediate reinforcements or evacuation, they're going to rely on someone remembering a fancy drum solo?" Major Reed, present at the briefing, had fixed him with a steely gaze. "Captain Jenkins, this system has proven its security and speed where traditional methods have failed. Its very fanciness, as you call it, is its strength. German intercepts are listening for patterns, for logic. This code to them sounds like chaotic noise." Jenkins remained unconvinced, but orders were orders. He ensured his designated signals man, Private Thomas "Tommy" Atkins, a former pub pianist, received the full training. Tommy surprisingly took to it with enthusiasm, finding a strange comfort in the rhythmic patterns amidst the grim realities of war. He practiced constantly, tapping on anything available, his mess kit, the side of his helmet, even his own leg, until the rhythms became second nature. The night of June 5, 1944 was thick with tension. Jenkins's battalion was among the first wave of paratroopers. Their drop was chaotic, scattered by unexpected flak and strong winds. Many landed miles from their intended zones. Communications immediately broke down. Radios were damaged, frequencies jammed, and the air filled with the desperate cries of disorganized units. Jenkins found himself with a fraction of his company, pinned down near a German strongpoint, far from the critical bridge he was supposed to secure. They desperately needed an updated objective, current enemy dispositions, and confirmation of friendly positions. His standard radio was dead. "Tommy!" Jenkins barked over the din of distant gunfire. "Can you get anything out? Anything at all?" Tommy, hunkered down, quickly assembled his small, emergency rhythmic transmitter, essentially a modified Morse key with a variable resistor to control pulse length and intensity, connected to a short-range radio. He tuned to a pre-arranged emergency frequency, a barely audible hum. He began tapping, not a series of frantic dots and dashes, but a deliberate syncopated rhythm, a unique pattern signaling urgent query, major read priority. The rhythm pulsed out into the chaotic airwaves, a tiny, almost imperceptible heartbeat amidst the thunder of war. Hours later, back in England, Major Reed's dedicated listening post picked up the faint, almost melodic sequence. The operator, a young woman named Eleanor, who had once played percussion in a symphony orchestra, immediately recognized the characteristic swing of Tommy Atkins's hand. "It's Captain Jenkins' unit, ma'am," she exclaimed, her voice tight with relief and urgency. "He's alive! Message incoming." Eleanor rapidly transcribed the complex rhythm. "Location compromised, heavy resistance, requesting new orders. Bridge X secured by 5th Parachute Battalion." The rhythm, seemingly random to any enemy listener, provided critical, actionable intelligence that saved Jenkins's fragmented unit from being annihilated and allowed them to reroute to support the 5th Battalion, reinforcing the secured bridge and repelling a swift German counterattack. For Jenkins, the experience was a profound revelation. The ridiculous rhythm had not only worked, but it had saved his men, cutting through the chaos where all other conventional methods had failed. He felt a profound, almost primal trust in the strange musical code. The success of the rhythmic code during the initial phases of D-Day led to its wider adoption, becoming an indispensable tool for covert communications. Its unique structure proved resistant to even the most sophisticated German intercept teams. Obersturmführer Klaus Richter, a brilliant German intelligence officer, was exasperated. His unit, specializing in Allied signal intercepts, had cracked dozens of British ciphers, but a new infuriating phenomenon had emerged. He called it the British static, or sometimes the ghost taps. His operators reported sporadic, irregular bursts of sound on Allied frequencies, not static precisely, but not discernible Morse or any known cipher. It sounded like someone was idly drumming on the radio set. Richter had ordered his best cryptographers to analyze the noise, convinced it must be a new, highly complex cipher. They spent weeks dissecting the waveforms, searching for mathematical sequences, for recurring patterns, for any hint of linguistic structure. But there was nothing. The rhythms defied their analytical tools. They were too fluid, too human, too uncoded. "It's maddening, Obersturmführer," reported a frustrated junior officer, presenting a sheaf of graphs showing what looked like random fluctuations. "It's completely devoid of logic. Perhaps it's a new jamming technique or a psychological warfare tactic to confuse us." Richter, however, couldn't shake the feeling that it was a message hidden in plain sight. He was a keen music enthusiast himself, with a particular fondness for German classical compositions. He knew the power of rhythm, but his mind, trained in the rigid logic of military codes, simply couldn't conceive of it as a language for military commands. He ordered a team to meticulously record every instance of ghost taps, hoping for a breakthrough. The code continued to serve with distinction through the Normandy campaign. Alistair Finch found himself traveling between various command centers, refining the system, expanding the lexicon of rhythmic commands, and training new recruits. The trust in the system grew exponentially. However, the unexpected success also presented its own dangers. As the war progressed, the rhythmic code became more widely used, its sheer effectiveness leading to increased reliance. This escalation eventually caused a critical oversight. In September 1944, during Operation Market Garden, a vast airborne assault aimed at capturing a series of bridges in the Netherlands, Alistair's code was heavily employed. Captain Jenkins's battalion, now seasoned veterans, was again at the forefront, tasked with securing a crucial bridge near Arnhem. The battle was a brutal, protracted affair, far more intense than anticipated. Communications were, once again, vital. One particularly harrowing day, Jenkins's forward observer, a young private named O'Malley sent a rhythm-coded message reporting an unexpected German panzer division advancing on their position, requesting urgent air support. The message was transmitted with flawless rhythm, picked up by an operator who transcribed it perfectly. However, the response came back, also rhythm-coded, instructing Jenkins to hold his position, stating that air support was unavailable and reinforcements were delayed. Jenkins was baffled. The situation was dire. Holding their position against tanks was suicidal. He knew his men couldn't withstand the assault. Something felt profoundly wrong. The rhythm of the incoming message, while technically correct, felt slightly off, a subtle difference in the attack of the notes, an almost imperceptible hesitation in the cadence that only a musician of Alistair's caliber or Tommy Atkins's trained ear might detect. But Tommy was wounded in a field hospital. Jenkins, relying on his gut, decided to ignore the order and began to prepare his men for a fighting retreat, improvising a new defensive line. It was during this exact period that Obersturmführer Richter, driven by a deep-seated suspicion, was making an unexpected breakthrough. One of his junior analysts, a young man named Schultz, had a peculiar hobby. He was an amateur jazz drummer. Schultz had spent hours listening to the recorded ghost taps, not trying to decode them mathematically, but simply listening to them as if they were music. One evening, frustrated by the lack of progress, he had started drumming along to a particularly long recording, trying to replicate the rhythm. Suddenly, a pattern clicked into place. Not a mathematical pattern, but a musical one. He recognized a common jazz cadence, a familiar syncopated phrase that, in a musical context, conveyed a sense of urgency or transition. He began to assign rough musical notes to the taps, creating a rudimentary transcription. The breakthrough wasn't about cracking a cipher, it was about recognizing a musical language. He rushed to Richter, explaining his hypothesis. "Obersturmführer," he stammered, "I believe it is not a cipher at all, but a musical code, like Morse, but with rhythm, not dots and dashes." Richter was initially furious, dismissing it as amateur theatrics, but Schultz demonstrated, playing a recording and then replicating a rhythmic sequence on a small drum pad, explaining what the musical feel of the sequence implied. He showed how a particular rhythm corresponded to a feeling of advance, another to hold position. Richter, a classical musician, was stunned. The ridiculous nature of the code, its very strength, had finally been unraveled by an equally unconventional mind. The ultimate irony. Richter immediately understood the devastating potential. If the British were using musical rhythms, then he could train his own musicians to interpret and even mimic the code. He formed a small, highly secretive unit of German musicians, tasking them with listening, learning, and eventually impersonating the Allied rhythm operators. They studied the recorded ghost taps for countless hours, internalizing the subtle nuances, the distinct swing of various British operators. Their goal was not just to decode, but to inject false information. This was the terrifying plot twist. The code's very effectiveness had made it too tempting a target for reverse engineering. The off-rhythm Captain Jenkins had sensed at Arnhem was not a mistake by an Allied operator. It was an enemy imitation. Richter's team, having successfully identified and replicated the hold position rhythm, had transmitted a false order, attempting to lure Jenkins's unit into an ambush. It was a close call, but Jenkins's musicians' ear for authenticity, developed by Tommy Atkins's unwavering faith in the system, had saved them. The implications were catastrophic. Alistair Finch received the full report of the Arnhem incident with a cold dread. The realization that his code, once unbreakable, had been compromised not through decryption, but through imitation, was a professional and personal blow. The subtlety he had built into the system, its very human touch, was now its Achilles heel. He initiated an immediate, urgent review of the system. He interrogated the operator who had sent the hold position message, who swore it was the authentic response from HQ. Alistair listened to recordings of the original message and the response over and over, until he too detected the almost imperceptible difference. The enemy wasn't breaking the code, they were performing a musical forgery. The solution, Alistair realized, lay in adding another layer of musical complexity, an operator-specific signature within the rhythm itself, like a musical fingerprint, almost undetectable unless one knew precisely what to listen for. This would require an even deeper level of musical training and synchronization, but it was their only hope. The revelation sent shockwaves through Allied intelligence. Major Reed, though dismayed, recognized the genius behind the German countermeasure and the urgent necessity for an equally ingenious response. Alistair worked feverishly, developing a system of individual rhythmic signatures for each operator, unique variations that would be woven into their transmissions. These were subtle personal flourishes, almost subconscious rhythmic ticks, but highly distinct to a trained ear. This meant every operator had to develop their own musical voice within the code, and every recipient had to learn to recognize not just the message rhythm, but the rhythmic signature of the sender. It was a massive undertaking, requiring retraining of the entire rhythm corps. The stakes were incredibly high. They had mere weeks before the next major offensive, the push towards the Rhine. The new system was implemented under immense pressure. Operators practiced their signatures relentlessly, embedding them into every message. They learned to listen for the absence or presence of these unique rhythmic fingerprints. Captain Jenkins, back on the front lines after Arnhem, became a staunch advocate for the refined system. He ensured his new signals officer, Private Eleanor Vance, the former orchestra percussionist now assigned to his unit, understood the critical importance of these individual signatures. She, too, had been trained by Alistair, and her discerning ear proved invaluable. The impact of Alistair's rhythmic code, both before and after its refinement, was profound and far-reaching. While precise statistics remain classified, anecdotal evidence and declassified operational reports indicate that the Rhythm Corps facilitated hundreds of critical, secure communications during major operations from D-Day to the Battle of the Bulge. The ability to transmit sensitive information, troop movements, enemy positions, urgent requests for air support, and even complex tactical maneuvers with unprecedented speed and security proved invaluable in numerous engagements. The system drastically reduced the time between intelligence gathering and actionable orders, often turning the tide in localized battles. After the war, the Rhythm Corps was quietly disbanded, its members returning to civilian life, their extraordinary contribution largely unknown to the public. Alistair Finch, offered a prestigious position in military intelligence, politely declined, choosing instead to return to his first love, music. He became a renowned jazz composer and educator, his experiences in the war subtly influencing his compositions, imbuing them with complex, layered rhythms that hinted at a deeper meaning. Major Evelyn Reed continued her distinguished career in intelligence, often citing Alistair's ingenuity as a prime example of how unconventional thinking could yield revolutionary results in the most dire circumstances. She championed the integration of diverse skill sets within military structures, forever changing the way intelligence agencies approached problem-solving. Captain Rhys Jenkins, having survived the war, often spoke of the ghost taps that saved his life at Arnhem, a testament to the unexpected power of a musician's ear in the cacophony of battle. The rhythmic code, a testament to innovation born from necessity, faded into the annals of classified history, but its legacy endured. It proved that the most secure codes are not always the most complex mathematically, but sometimes the most deeply human, rooted in art, intuition, and the subtle nuances of perception. It was a reminder that even in the brutal logic of war, creativity and the unexpected skills of individuals could be the most powerful weapons of all. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.